Okay, so you ready to dive into some economics?
Always. Especially with this stack of intro material you sent over. Back to basics.
Back to basics. It is, but trust me, this stuff is way more interesting than it sounds back in school.
hmm
We're going to be talking about how people make decisions when they can't have everything they want.
Which is like all the time, right?
Literally all the time.
Yeah, and that's what's so fascinating about economics. It's not just about money or anything. It's about understanding the choices we make every single day, like from what we have for breakfast to how we spend our weekends,
I feel that.
and how those choices all add up and impact the world around us.
Right. So it's like this giant puzzle where every decision, big or small, fits into a larger picture.
Exactly. And today's deep dive is all about equipping you with the tools to think like an economist.
Huh. Okay, I like the sound of that. So the outline here mentions microeconomics and macroeconomics. Is that kind of like zooming in on individual decisions and then panning out to the big picture?
Precisely.
Okay, cool.
We'll start with microeconomics, which is like that street level view of economics. We'll unpack examples from the source material, like why you might choose a 4K TV over a regular one, or how those video game sales work, or like even the impact streaming services have had on how we watch movies.
That's so true.
It's all about individual choices. Yours, mine, everyone's.
So understanding the why
hmm
behind our everyday decisions,
hmm
but then we zoom out to macroeconomics, right?
Yeah.
That's the global view, the forces that shape entire economies.
Absolutely. We'll delve into things like U.S. job growth, the rise of economic powerhouses like China and India, and of course, we can't forget about the ever-present U.S. budget deficit.
From my Netflix queue to the national debt, this deep dive really does cover it all. But before we get ahead of ourselves, the source material emphasizes 6 key concepts that are crucial for understanding how economists think. It's like these are the secret decoder rings for the world of economics.
Think of them as the fundamental principles that underpin all economic models and theories. Once you grasp these concepts, you'll start seeing them everywhere.
Okay, hit me with concept number 1. What's the first key to unlocking this whole economic mystery?
It all starts with the idea that trade-offs are inevitable. Every choice we make means giving something else up.
So there's no such thing as a free lunch.
Exactly. The source material gives a great example. Imagine you're deciding whether to study for that big exam or catch up on your favorite online game. Every minute you spend doing one, you can't spend doing the other. That lost time represents the opportunity cost of your decision.
So even if we don't always realize it, every choice comes with a hidden price tag, the value of the next best alternative that we give up. Okay, on to concept number 2. What's the next economic principle we need to wrap our heads around?
Economists assume that people are generally rational, meaning they aim to make choices that maximize their well-being, given the resources they have, of course.
So we're all secret optimizers, always trying to get the most bang for our buck, so to speak.
In a way, yes, but of course we don't always have perfect information when we're making decisions, and sometimes our emotions can get in the way. A rational choice in the heat of the moment might not always look so great in retrospect.
You're telling me,
Hmm.
like that extra slice of pizza I devoured, even though I was already stuffed, totally rational at the time, but my stomach might disagree later. Which brings us to concept number 3, thinking at the margin. What's that all about?
It's about recognizing that most choices aren't all or nothing decisions. It's about weighing the additional benefits of something against its additional costs.
So going back to the pizza example, it's not about whether I should order the entire pizza or none at all. It's about deciding whether each additional slice is worth the extra calories, the extra costs, the potential stomachache.
Precisely. It's about those incremental choices and finding the point where the additional benefit no longer outweighs the additional cost.
This is making me rethink my pizza consumption habits. But on a more serious note, I can see how this concept applies to all sorts of decisions, from how much we're willing to spend on a new phone to how much time we invest in a particular project. Okay, what's next on our list of economic principles?
Incentives matter, and they're everywhere.
Okay, I have a feeling this one's going to be interesting. We all respond to incentives, even if we don't realize it right, like how a sale might convince us to buy something we didn't know we needed.
Exactly. Incentives can be anything from prices and taxes to bonuses, social pressure, or even the fear of missing out. The source material highlights a clever example: the fuel tax and its impact on the popularity of smaller, more fuel-efficient cars.
Right. The higher the fuel tax, the more incentive people have to choose cars that sip gas instead of guzzling it.
Mm-hmm.
Makes sense. Okay, we've covered 4 key concepts. Trade-offs are inevitable, people are generally rational, think at the margin, and incentives matter. What are the last 2 principles we need to complete our crash course in thinking like an economist?
The fifth concept is about information. Economists acknowledge that we don't always have all the information we need to make perfectly informed decisions.
Yeah, like buying a used car that turns out to be a lemon. No amount of economic theory can help you there.
Nope.
Okay, so what about that last key concept? Fill me in.
The sixth one, it focuses on distribution, like
Yeah.
who ultimately gets what in the economic system.
So it's not just about how much stuff we make, it's about how all those goods and services get divvied up.
Exactly. Distribution, key part of economics, often linked to questions of fairness and equity.
Right, right.
The source material actually touches on income inequality as a prime example. You know how certain individuals or groups can sometimes end up with a disproportionately large or small slice of the economic pie?
Yeah, for sure. Man, this is really making me think about the bigger picture here. How our individual choices and those like larger economic forces all kind of like intersect. And speaking of forces, can we talk about supply and demand? I feel like those two words are at the heart of every economics discussion I've ever heard.
Absolutely. Supply and demand, those are fundamental to how markets work. And it all goes back to that concept of scarcity we talked about earlier. I
Right.
mean, if there were just an endless supply of everything, we wouldn't need economics.
Because we'd all just have everything we wanted. All the time. No trade-offs necessary.
Exactly. But back here in the real world, we have limited resources, which is where supply and demand comes in.
Okay, so refresh my memory. What do those curves actually represent?
Okay, so the demand curve shows us how much of something people are willing to buy at different price points. Think about it. How much are you willing to pay for a cup of coffee?
Probably a lot less than I am now if it suddenly costs like 10 bucks a cup.
Exactly. That's the law of demand in action. Generally, the higher the price, the lower the quantity demanded.
Okay, and then on the flip side, we have the supply curve, right?
Yeah.
Which shows how much producers are willing to sell at different prices. So is that why diamonds are so expensive? Because they're sparkly, A&D, there's limited supply.
You got it. The interaction of those two curves, supply and demand, that's what determines the price of goods and services in a market.
So it's like this constant dance between buyers and sellers, each responding to those price signals. Man, this is making economics sound almost graceful. But what happens when things get a little messy? The source material mentioned something called elasticity. Does that have to do with how much those curves can bend without breaking?
Elasticity, yeah, that's a really important concept. It basically helps us understand how sensitive demand or supply is to changes in price.
Okay, hit me with some real-world examples, because I always learn best with illustrations.
Okay, well, the source material uses this great one. The price of orange juice after a frost.
Okay.
The demand for orange juice is relatively inelastic, meaning people will still buy it even if the price goes up because of that frost damage.
Makes sense. People need their vitamin C frost or no frost. What's another example?
A more serious one from the source material deals with the high prices of life-saving medication. Demand is very inelastic when it's a matter of life or death. Creates some complex ethical dilemmas.
Wow, yeah, that's a heavy one. So elasticity, it's about more than just numbers on a graph. It has real-world implications for things like access to essential goods, even healthcare. This deep dive is really making me consider these everyday economic forces in a whole new light.
And that's exactly what we're aiming for. Economics isn't just about abstract theories, it's about understanding the forces that shape our lives.
Speaking of which, we've talked a lot about how markets work, but what happens when they don't. The source material mentions something called market failure. Should the government step in to try and fix things, or is it better to just let the market sort itself out?
Ah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a debate that's been going on for centuries. Markets can be very efficient at allocating resources, but that doesn't always mean that the outcome is fair or equitable.
So it's a trade-off again. Efficiency versus fairness.
Many times, yes.
Okay, so what are some examples of how the government tries to intervene in markets?
Well, the source material gives us a few. One common intervention is a price ceiling, like rent control. A price ceiling aims to make housing more affordable, especially in cities with super high housing costs.
Rent control, yeah. That sounds like a good thing on the surface, but are there any potential downsides?
Well, while rent control can definitely make housing more affordable for some, it can also lead to some unintended consequences.
Like,
For example, if the government sets a price ceiling on rent that's below the market equilibrium, so below what the price would be if supply and demand were just left alone, it can actually lead to a shortage of available housing.
wait, really? How does that work?
Well, think about it from a landlord's perspective. If they can't charge enough rent to cover their costs, things like their mortgage payments, property taxes, maintenance, all that stuff, they might choose not to rent out their property at all.
So they might sell it or even just leave it vacant.
Precisely.
Ouch. Okay, that makes sense. So it's like this delicate balancing act trying to make housing affordable without discouraging those landlords from renting out their properties. What about other types of government interventions?
Another example the source material talks about is the minimum wage, which acts as a price floor. The lowest hourly wage an employer can legally pay. And the goal there is to try to ensure that all workers earn a living wage.
Which is a good thing, right? I mean, we all want to live in a society where everyone can afford those basic necessities.
Absolutely. But like most economic policies, raising the minimum wage can have some unintended consequences too.
Yeah, makes sense.
If businesses are forced to pay their workers more, they might try to offset those costs in other ways. Like maybe they reduce their workforce, or cut back on employee hours, or even raise prices for consumers.
So again, it's a trade-off. More money for some workers, but potentially fewer jobs overall or higher prices for everyone. Are there any solutions that economists generally agree on?
One area where there is some pretty broad agreement is the need to invest in education and job training. By equipping people with the skills they need to thrive in this ever-changing economy, you can start addressing some of the root causes of poverty and income inequality.
That makes a lot of sense. Invest in people,
Yeah,
not just temporary fixes.
exactly. And it circles back to that idea of thinking like an economist, understanding the incentives at play for both individuals and businesses, and then designing policies that actually encourage the outcomes we want to see.
This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about. I'm realizing that economics, it's more than just like memorizing definitions and theories. It's really about applying these principles to the real world, to the choices that we're making every single day.
Could have said it better myself. The source material does a great job of highlighting that economics isn't just some abstract concept. It's about understanding the forces that shape our lives.
Totally.
It's about that morning cup of coffee, the job market, everything.
So to wrap up this deep dive, what's the one big takeaway you want to leave our listeners with? What's that thought-provoking nugget they can carry with them?
We've talked a lot about trade-offs today.
I have.
But here's a final one to really consider. The trade-off between efficiency and fairness. Like, markets are often very efficient at allocating resources, but that doesn't always mean the outcome is fair or just.
So just because the system is good at like churning out goods and services, that doesn't mean it's always distributing them in a way that benefits everyone equally.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. And where I think individual choices can really make a difference. I mean, we've seen how government policies can try to nudge the market towards more equitable outcomes, but those policies, they're often debated and imperfect.
And don't forget about those special interest groups we talked about earlier.
Yeah, for sure.
They can really muddy the waters when it comes to designing policies that are truly in the best interest of everyone.
Right. They add another whole layer of complexity for sure. So the question I want to leave you with is this. What role do you think you have in creating a more just and equitable economy?
Ooh, that's a powerful question to end on. It's a good reminder that economics, it's not just about numbers and graphs, it's about people. It's about the choices we make every day, whether it's as consumers, workers, business owners, or citizens.
Precisely. And by understanding the forces that shape our economic landscape, we can start to make more informed choices. Choices that benefit not just ourselves, but our communities and the world around us.
This deep dive has given me a lot to think about, for sure. It feels like economics is way more than just a subject you study in school. It's like a lens for understanding the world, for seeing those connections between our individual choices and the bigger picture.
Couldn't said it better myself. And that's the beauty of economics. It's a constantly evolving field that touches every single aspect of our lives.